And we are now recording. So, all right, wonderful. Welcome to this talk today, which I hope to also kind of become a conversation at the end, and is noted in an after hours conversation after the fact. I'm Garrett Broad. I'm a professor at Rowan University, which is in southern New Jersey, outside of Philadelphia in the US. And I'm going to be talking about changing the world for animals, narratives, networks, and place. And so I'm just going to jump right in. And I want to start with a reality, which I'm sure you're all quite familiar with, right? Which is that in the US, where I'm located, in the UK, where Animal Think Tank, and I know a number of you are located as well, the reality is that issues related to animal protection, animal freedom are simply not a top priority for most people, right? When we do polling of these issues in the US and the UK, they don't even ask about animal protection, animal welfare as a top priority. It might be included in some respect within conversations about the environment, for instance, right? But we know this, right? It's things like economy in the US, immigration and health in the US, terrorism and money and politics and healthcare costs. These are the big picture issues that most folks are focused on. Most folks, when it comes to organizational activity, these are a lot of the big areas, right? So the question I really want to open with today is, what are you doing here? What brings you to this conversation? What makes you different, right? What makes you spending this time at an Animal Think Tank webinar and conversation? And so I want to specifically ask, what inspired you to care so much about animals? And from there, it's one thing to be inspired. It's one thing to, get this issue on your radar and to have some concern about it, but it's tougher to stay committed to that issue over time. So what helps you sustain your commitment to the cause? I want to give you a second just to think about that. What inspired you and what helps you sustain your commitment to the cause? And my guess is, and the argument that I'm going to be making in this presentation today is, it's probably got something to do with the intersection of three big picture principles that I'm going to be discussing today. So the first is narratives and the stories we tell, right? So there's probably some story that came to you that shifted the way at some point you think about animals, or maybe shaped the way you think about animals to begin with, that got you inspired and motivated to care. But it's not just about narratives. It's not just about stories. It's also about networks. It's about the connections we forge. So my hunch is there are also individuals and organizations that you're connected to that keep you and help you sustain that inspiration over the course of time, especially in a world where this is not an issue that most people make a primary area of focus. And the third piece I'm going to talk about is place, the spaces of everyday life. What are those physical and digital spaces where you engage with these narratives, where you connect with your networks that inspire you, that help you sustain your commitment?
Oh, I see.
Narratives, network, and place.
Yeah.
I hear somebody chatting in the back, so maybe our host can make sure that we mute. And now I'm unmuted. You should hear me, okay? So that's what I'm going to talk about today: narratives, network, and place. And the argument I'm going to be making is that an understanding of these individually, yes, but really in concert with each other, can really help us understand how social change takes place in general, and particularly how we can leverage these concepts to make the world a better place for animals, to promote animal welfare, animal protection, and animal freedom, which I know is what brings us all together today and what drives the work of Animal Think Tank. So you might be wondering, I know some of you I see in the list of names, so welcome to those I know, but a lot of you I don't know, so it might be useful just to have a little bit of background about who I am and how I come to this work. So as noted, I'm a professor and a researcher, a teacher and a writer focused on food systems and social change. My background, my PhD, is in communication studies, trained in a kind of interdisciplinary approach, blending the social sciences and the humanities. I did my PhD at the University of Southern California, and there I was really trained as part of a research team called the Metamorphosis Project under the advisement of Sandra Ball-Rokeach, a sociologist and thinker on social change and the role of media and communication and social change. What we did in that project was really focus in on community level social change. And the big insight of that work and the theoretical framework that we used focused on this idea of what we called the local storytelling network. And what we were able to demonstrate and then actually sort of actively leverage was that when there were sort of stronger flows of stories happening between networks of residents and families and their interpersonal contexts, local and ethnic media within the community, and community-based organizations. That the stronger the network, the stronger the flow of stories between these different community storytellers was, the better outcomes we saw in local communities for things like civic engagement, neighborhood belonging, and community health. And so that foundation, as we'll talk about, you'll see sort of big principles here, the sort of networks and narratives in place already present in that training that I got. I then applied a lot of these concepts to work that I was doing in LA and other cities across the US, looking at food access and what we often refer to as food justice, basically groups using food as a tool to promote community economic development and combat racism and inequality. And so that became my dissertation project and my first book project, More Than Just Food. But I've also had this long-term interest in animal issues. And so over the last several years, this has been work that has sometimes been in parallel to my kind of community-based food activist scholarship, but also at times intersecting with that work. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some work that I did in collaboration with the Non-Human Rights Project, which advocates for legal rights for non-human animals. Did some surveys and focus group research that came out of that I'll discuss. I've also, my research has been funded by groups like the United States Department of Agriculture and the National Institutes of Food and Agriculture, looking at public perceptions of food and new food technology and meat alternatives. So I'll also draw from some of that, both quantitative and qualitative work that has looked at some of those issues. And then, as was already mentioned a little bit, I also, try to be an academic who engages with folks that are actually doing this work on the ground, trying to make the world a better place for people and for non-human animals. And so I write, not just for academic publication, but also for, journalistic outlets. You see a couple listed there. I think Natalie said she was going to share the link to my piece in Vox. I also serve as the president of the board for the Plant-Based Foods Institute, which is a nonprofit organization that's advocating for food system change to promote a more plant-based food system in the US and around the world. And so with all of this together, there are a couple kind of key theoretical frameworks that guide all the work that I do. And so I wanted to introduce those first, and then from there talk about a couple specific research projects that put these principles into practice, and then wrap up by talking about what does this all mean for folks who are doing both scholarship and advocacy and activism on animal protection and animal freedom. So the first big picture concept I want to talk about is what's referred to as the socio-ecological model of communication and behavior change. This is a framework for thinking. It's very prominent in public health and in communication about how health behavior takes shape and also how we can intervene to change knowledge, attitudes, and practices related to a variety of issues. And the big picture takeaway of models like this is it takes a systems approach to analysis. It basically says, yes, individual attitudes and behaviors matter, but we can't just understand individuals without understanding the broader context of their social networks, of the community norms that matter to them, of the broader societal norms in which those operate, and nested within the physical environments and infrastructures in which they live, work, and play. And a really key insight of models like this is that higher levels of analysis and higher levels of an action here facilitate or constrain change at lower levels of analysis. So what does that mean? Well, it means that if you want to change the behaviors or the attitudes of individuals, it's going to be much easier to do, much more likely to have a sustainable change if you're also operating at the level of social networks and at community and at society and at the physical environment itself, right? And so that what we do at these multiple levels of analysis influences everything at a lower level of analysis. And so if we're trying to intervene and make social change happen, the most effective approach, challenging to do, is going to be one that operates at multiple levels. That is not just trying to change individuals, but is also trying to shift networks and communities and societies. So that's one big picture theoretical concept that plays a big role in the work that I do. Another comes more from the social psychology world, the behavioral economics world, and this is about the way our minds work. And this might be familiar to folks, very famous book, Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, who actually recently passed away. But he developed what is often referred to as the dual process model of cognition. And it basically says that within our mind, we kind of have two different brains. We have two different modes of thinking and acting, system one and system two, what we often call the automatic system or the deliberative system. So the automatic system, this is what we use to decide most of our decisions throughout our daily life, right? It's our automatic, effortless, impressionistic, associative, intuitive thinking. It's all these heuristics and shortcuts that we have in our brain that help shape what we do and why we do it. We don't think deeply. If we thought deeply about every single decision we made, we wouldn't be able to get out of bed in the morning, right? And so much of our brain defaults to this automatic system of thinking. But we also have this other system of thinking, this deliberative model of thinking. It's slower, right? It constructs thoughts in an orderly series. It's effortful. It's based on reasoning and is reflective. And this way of thinking about how we think also shapes how we intervene and persuade, right? And so for some issues, we might want to see, how do we leverage the automatic system? How do we change the, as we'll talk a little bit later, the choice architecture around folks, for instance, to make the decision that we want them to make the easier decision so they don't have to think much about it. But other issues, especially issues that require kind of major changes to our identity and our worldview, that is not going to be able to be leveraged through the automatic system. That requires us going through this deliberative system, right? So the good news about the deliberative system is if we're able to really persuade people through that effortful, reasoning, reflective approach, people who change their minds in that way, that change is likely to be much more sustainable, right? It's a deeper change, but it's harder to appeal to people in that way. The automatic system, it can be easier to make changes and get people to, change their behaviors. However, it's often based on these shortcuts that are not as persistent. And so thinking about how automatic systems and deliberative systems work in terms of our mind and in terms of making persuasion and social change happen, really central to the way I approach my work and a really major concept in contemporary social movement studies and studies of psychology and social change. So with all of that as a kind of theoretical background, the socio-ecological model, the two modes of thinking, I want to introduce kind of three big projects that I've worked on that help us demonstrate these principles in action, and with attention, as I said, to these three concepts that I think emerge out of these broader theoretical frameworks. So I'm going to talk about the importance of narratives for social change as it pertains to animals. And we're going to talk about research I've done looking at animal categories as a type of story. Then we're going to talk about networks, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the effective altruism community and research that I've done into the effective altruism community and the impact that it's had on the broader animal advocacy community, and vice versa, what animal advocacy has done to the effective altruism community. And then the last little case study I'm going to do is on choice architecture and dietary change. As you'll see, these socio-ecological model, the different modes of thinking, they're going to be kind of coming through in each of these projects. And then as I'm also going to really emphasize, it's not about studying these in isolation, right? The key argument I'm going to be making today is that if we really want to maximize our potential for social change, we need to think about how narratives inform networks, inform place, how these things work together, and that's going to help us lead to the most potential for sustainable social change. All right, so let's jump into the first research project that I want to talk about. Narratives, the stories we tell. So why narratives? Well, if you're engaged with the work of Animal Think Tank, you're already familiar with the importance of narratives. I think they do a really great job of emphasizing the role that narratives play in our life and in social change. I often go back to this quote by a guy named George Gerbner, a longtime professor at the University of Pennsylvania, who wrote a lot about the role of storytelling in shaping what we know about the world and what action we can take. As he says, most of what we know or think we know, we've never personally experienced. We live in a world erected by stories. They weave the seamless web of our cultural environment. And importantly, he continues to say that who tells the stories of a culture really governs human behavior, right? So really demonstrating the power that stories play in shaping the way we construct the world around us. So what does that mean for animals? Well, we have lots of different stories we tell about ourselves and our relationship to animals and different types of animals. And so this comes from a survey I conducted, as I mentioned, a collaboration with the Non-Human Rights Project a couple of years ago. This was a US-based sample. And one of the things I asked folks was, do you consider yourself an animal lover? And this is a term that gets used a lot in the US. And about 75% of the sample said, yes, I agree with that statement. I consider myself an animal lover. You see, less than 10% of people don't consider themselves an animal lover, right? So this is a story that a lot of people like to tell themselves, right? They love animals. They care deeply about animals. I even asked some questions more specific to the work of the Non-Human Rights Project about legal rights for animals, asked them which of these statements comes closest to their view about the treatment of animals. So one option was that animals deserve the exact same rights as people to be free from harm and exploitation. 47% of this sample, and this has actually been matched pretty closely in some other surveys. When you ask this question in this way, almost half of the sample says animals deserve the exact same rights as people to be free from harm and exploitation. The next group, also about 47%, said animals deserve some protection from harm and exploitation, but it's still appropriate to use them for the benefit of humans. And less than 6% said animals don't need much protection from harm and exploitation since they're just animals, right? So based on this, we would think, hey, we're in a good shape, right? Almost half the population in the US thinks animals deserve the exact same rights as people. But let's dig a little bit deeper. In that same survey, what did I find? Well, about 5% of the sample, and this matches, US and UK trends, about 5% of the sample identified as vegetarian or vegan, with another 6% as a sort of flexitarian, right? So how do we have 75% of people calling themselves animal lovers, 47% of people saying animals deserve the exact same rights as people, but only 5% who are choosing not to eat those animals, right? There's clearly a disconnect here. And so this is why I like to do multi-methodological research. The surveys tell us something, but interviews and focus groups tell us something interesting as well. So I dug deeper into this, into some focus groups with folks in the States, and these are the kinds of things I heard, right? Animals is a very big word. There are sort of a lot of categories to animals. I don't think you can apply one rule that fits everything. It's kind of complex. And so the argument I'm going to be making here is that people have different stories about different types of animals, about categories of animals, and the obligations that we have to those animals and the rights that those animals themselves hold. And so I continue to explore this through some survey research as well, working with a colleague, Ezgi Ayturk, a really great quantitative psychologist. And so we did another survey, and we asked people in this survey, when you think about different types of animals in the world, we have different levels of concern. We might have different levels of concern for their well-being. So we gave them a big list of animals, actually included more than the animals you see on your screen right here. And we asked them on a scale of 1 to 4, how much concern they have for their well-being of each. And it was 1 was not much, and 4 was a great deal of concern. And so what we found was that there were kind of clusters of concern. This is something I write about in that Vox article that we mentioned before. And these different animals sort of ended up kind of clustering into these different categories, right? And the categories we came up with, emerging from what we were hearing in the surveys and the focus groups, was there were some animals they considered wildlife, the sort of charismatic megafauna, some animals that they just considered food or farmed animals, other animals they considered pests, and other animals they considered companion animals. And depending on where folks categorize these animals, the different stories they told about where they fit, we saw very different ideas about what our rights and obligations were to these animals. So I'm going to put some numbers up. The important thing to note about these numbers is if you see a green highlight, that means that these animals got a sort of statistically significant high level of concern. If you see a red number, it's a statistically significant low level of concern. And if it's a black number, it just means they were somewhere around the average, right? So for this wildlife group, like elephants and whales, we saw really high levels of concern, some, statistically significant. And folks would tell me things like, it's wonderful if they can be out in the wild, but maybe we're saving them if we have them in the zoo. I don't know, right? But the big picture on this wildlife group was we want them to have good lives. We respect that, we respect their right to be free and wild. Maybe that, is best served by them being out in the wild, but maybe actually zoos do a great job of that, right? People weren't quite sure, but the big picture story they were telling was that animals like elephants and whales deserved this kind of protection, deserve this right to live in a dignified way. They weren't sure whether zoos were the place, but they believed that there was moral concern that should be extended to these types of animals. Contrast that with chickens, turkeys, cows, pigs, animals that folks put in that food and farm category. Here we heard a lot of stories of kind of cognitive dissonance, or just stories of trying not to think about these animals at all, right? This one person said, I feel bad about eating pig because the more I learn about the animal, the more I realize it's about as intelligent as a dog. It makes me feel kind of bad, but bacon is delicious, right? We hear this all the time. Folks come up with ways to just move animals like pigs and cows and chickens into this food category. And so they are able to kind of push their moral concern out so that they're not concerned as they're eating, right? And can just focus on that they like to eat bacon. For some animals, we see snakes, rats, cockroaches, spiders. These pest animals, for many people, as this one person said, I don't look at pests like that as animals at all, right? I don't look at rats and roaches and stuff. Even though they're animals, I don't look at them as animals, right? So this, suggests that when we were asking that question before, do you think all animals, deserve the same rights as people? For a lot of people, what they were telling me is when they looked at that survey question, they weren't thinking about some of these, the animals included in that category as animals. Instead, a lot of what they were thinking about were companion animals, dogs, horses, cats, maybe, charismatic megafauna like elephants. But here we see the stories people tell of companion animals is that, things like dogs are so in tune to what we go through as humans. People don't give them enough credit for their knowledge, their feelings, their perception about what we go through as humans. The stories people tell about these companions is one of love, of companionship, of being part of the family, often of preferring them to humans at times, right? And so, yes, all animals, but the stories people tell here are very different, right? And they're able to create these different animal categories, these different stories about where different types of animals fit, and within that category, what obligations we owe to them, what rights they deserve. And so what do we do about this, right? Well, one of the things we see right now is that people have really placed different types of animals into an automatic category, right? And so this automatic thinking takes hold where they say, okay, chickens, they're a food animal, and I've got this automatic category here. That's where they live, right? But we have efforts by groups like Animal Think Tank that are trying to use other types of narratives to change that story, right? To change the traditions that we have in terms of where different animals are placed. And we know that this is possible because in different cultures and over different periods of time, different animals are placed in different categories, right? Horses are companions in some places, they're wildlife in other places, they're food in other places. And so here I go back to another one of my favorite quotes. This comes from the sociologist Anthony Giddens, who talks about all traditions being invented traditions that have been invented for a diversity of reasons. And importantly, traditions evolve over time and can also be quite suddenly altered or transformed. They are invented and reinvented. So the task here, and what groups like Animal Think Tank are doing, is trying to get people to think more deeply, right? Using that deliberative system about the stories they tell about different types of animals, with the hopes that one day we can create a new tradition that really expands that moral circle to include, more animals automatically in those categories of animals that deserve the types of consideration and protection that I know many of us around this call think all animals deserve, right? But how do we do that? Can we do that just by appealing to individuals? The argument I'm going to be making here is that individual appeals are valuable, but not enough, right? That we also need to be thinking about individuals as part of broader social networks and communities if we want to make that change stick. And so here I move to the second case, which is exploring networks and the connections that we forge. Why networks? Well, as the biologist Edward O. Wilson says, human beings are enmeshed in social networks. Like the proverbial fish in the sea, we find it difficult to conceive of any place different from this mental environment we have evolved, right? Humans are deeply social creatures, deeply embedded in these social networks. And so anything related to social change and trying to, persuade and change the story has to take into account what is the story, not just among individuals, but within broader social networks, especially if we're trying to bring forth what Damon Santola, a communication scholar and sociologist, calls complex contagions, right? This more complex approach to changing the way people think and act and behave. Complex contagions are contagions that people resist. The key to their success, as he notes in his book Change, looking at specific successful social movements, was to have their messages take root in their social network in the right way, within clusters of redundant ties. Here, importantly for our purposes, more important than the stickiness of the message is the social reinforcement it gets, right? So you can craft the perfect message, but if it's not resonating and getting reinforced within a social network that is important to someone, then it's not going to be effective over time. And he contrasts this, between what he calls the complex network versus the more simple network contagions. For certain things, it's totally fine to have kind of one person or one organization at the center that's kind of blasting out the big messages, right? This is useful for spreading information quickly, but it's not that useful for persuasion, especially persuasion that goes against existing social norms. Instead, strong social ties, these complex contagions, look more like this image on the left, where there's an abundance of social redundancy, trust and intimacy, and a foundation for cooperation and solidarity, where folks are being exposed to the same concepts, the same stories, the same messages over time by multiple contexts that they trust, right? Not just getting this message from one person, having it go out into the world, but rather consistently hearing these stories reinforced by contexts that they trust, whether they're individuals or their organizations. And so a project where I've explored sort of this role of networks in spreading different ways of thinking is by looking at the effective altruism movement and its role within the broader animal protection community. I published a piece about this going back to 2018, and I was just at the time really interested to see a bunch of people who I had been involved in animal advocacy for a while, but this kind of influx of folks from the effective altruism movement who were starting to have a major role, particularly funding organizations, but also as advocates and activists, and hearing the sort of stories they were bringing, the different ways they were thinking about these issues, and seeing it really become a major part of the broader animal protection movement. I thought this was really interesting, and I could do a whole hour or more just on effective altruism, and controversial in a lot of ways, and I'm not really want to get into too much of that. Maybe in the Q&A we can talk about that more. What I really want to focus on right now is how did effective animal advocacy, how did the effective altruism approach, the story that they tell, become such a major part of the broader animal protection movement over the last decade or so? This is something that in an interview, Lewis Bollard of the Open Philanthropy Project told me, which was, the most important thing he said is, how much good are we doing for animals? If you've ever engaged with effective altruists, this is the line we hear over and over again, right? Instilling that value, saying that's what we really care about, for making grants, renewing grants, everything. That's basically a single metric. And so what I tried to do in my work on this topic was really catalog, like, what are the key terms being used by folks in this effective altruism and effective animal advocacy movement. I ran a bunch of focus groups with folks who saw themselves at the intersection and kept hearing these key concepts, right? Like, how much good are we doing for animals as the key question to ask, right? Which connects to this concept of what they call their importance or the scale of the issue with which they're engaging. They also talk a lot about tractability, which is, can we actually make a difference in this space? They also talk about neglectedness, meaning, is there room for more funding? Is there room for more advocates and activists in this space, right? But this importance, tractability, neglectedness framework, my guess is, if you have been involved in animal protection for more than 10, 15 years, this was not something that you really engaged with until the effective altruism movement, in these terms, I should say. Of course, you were engaging with these questions, I'm sure, before, but in these terms, with this particular very EA utilitarian way of thinking, my hunch is that this is something that you've really seen grow in prominence and in influence over the course of the last 10 years. And you might be saying, yeah, well, it's because they've got tons of money, right? And I think that's a big part of it, right? Tons of money, big grants from the Open Philanthropy Project, lots of money being moved by animal charity evaluators and other groups like them, right, to support causes and organizations that align with the broader effective altruism approach. But there's a lot of things that have a lot of money in a lot of places, and they don't all take hold. They don't all transform movements in the way that I think effective altruism has had a major impact on the animal protection and animal freedom movement, right? And so what's going on here? Well, what's going on is that this money is being used to create lots and lots of redundant ties, right? Through interorganizational collaboration, through bringing young activists and advocates and practitioners into these movements who are exposed to the messages and the philosophy of effective altruism, bringing that into this broader network of the animal protection community, right? We see this through things like animal charities, top charity recommendations, through the different animal welfare funds, right? And we see also really interesting cross-pollination between the traditional animal protection movement. So some of these groups are groups that have been around for a long time, not necessarily aligned with effective altruism directly, and others are groups that are specifically out of the effective altruism community. This is that kind of classic complex contagion happening, right? This message, it's not just about the message, right? It's about how this message gets continually reinforced through multiple redundant interpersonal and interorganizational ties over the course of time. You can see this, I think, with a specific example of how the effective altruism movement talks about this concept of wild animal welfare. Of course, animal protection advocates have been talking about wild animals for a long, long time, right? But EAs have this particular way of thinking about it, of using a utilitarian calculus in terms of what's worthy of supporting in terms of activism and action on these issues. This comes from a post by someone named Evan Gainsbauer on the EA forum. And you can see what they're doing is they're basically breaking down how this concept of reducing wild animal suffering has been put forth through this interorganizational networks, right? Some of them specifically from the effective altruism community, like the Effective Altruism Foundation, others that are more focused on animal issues specifically, like animal charity evaluators, sentience, animal ethics, right? But it's all about these intersecting and reinforcing nodes in these networks that has made this issue and this framing of wild animal welfare from the kind of EA perspective become something that is now part of the broader animal protection universe, but also has become part of the effective altruism universe. So you see an organization like 80,000 Hours, which advises people on career paths. Right now, factory farming, wild animal suffering, not the top priorities for this group. It's below some of these other things like AI and pandemics and nuclear war, et cetera. But we can see, they also place factory farming. They also place wild animal suffering as, priorities that folks might think about going into. And so this is, again, just an example of how these network effects over time, it's not just about the message, it's about their redundancy in these networks have shifted the animal protection movement, as I'm sure many of you can speak to, the way that this EA thinking and narrative has become part of our broader parlance, but also how the animal protection approach has become part of the broader effective altruism movement. And we can talk again about where the effective altruism movement is, sort of post-SBF and all that sort of stuff. But I think their influence in the animal protection movement is still here. And we can talk about what the implications of that are if folks are interested in Q&A. But all of this, again, I think is also reflecting, the socio-ecological model, right? It's not just about appealing to individuals. It's also about their social networks. It's about their communities. And it's also about, appealing to people with these deliberative, persuasive arguments. But over time, it becomes automatic. Right? That now within the animal protection movement, some of the EA principles have just become things folks are really familiar with. And also within the effective altruism movement, animal issues are something that are now considered worthy of consideration in ways that they might not have been 10, 15 years ago for a lot of people who are in that broader kind of rationalist and community, right? And another important thing to note here is that all these conversations, these networked actions, this storytelling, they don't happen in outer space, right? They don't happen in the ether. This is a map of effective altruism that Scott Alexander put together. And here he talks about, this is more of a conceptual map. This is not, a real map, but he notes these very specific places that exist, right? The Good Food Institute, Animal Charity Evaluators, Center for Effective Altruism, at the intersection between animal welfare and effective altruism, global poverty, et cetera. And one of the things I want to emphasize last here is that these places matter, right? These places as organizations, as digital spaces for convening conversation, but also as physical places where people gather and have conversation, right? So this is kind of the last piece of the puzzle. We've talked about narratives, we've talked about networks. What about the place piece here? So place, I call here the spaces of everyday life, quoting from Yi-Fu Tuan, who's a leading thinker and theorist around place and geography. And he notes that place has more substance than the word location suggests. It's a unique entity, a special ensemble. It has history and meaning. It incarnates the experiences and aspirations of people, right? And so place plays a really key role as sort of the site where our network action takes shape and where those narratives can flow through those networks over time. And I see this a ton in discussions about dietary change and the role of choice architecture, our spatial environments around our dietary practices. This comes from some recent focus groups I've been conducting with people about their perceptions of meat and meat alternatives. I just think this is really interesting and speaks to the role that different places with different meanings have on the way people's dietary practices take shape. And so this was a guy who was telling me, yeah, I'm a longtime vegetarian. I'm not a strict vegan or vegetarian though, right? So when he's at home, I cook for myself, it's all vegan. But when I'm out with other people, I'll eat the kind of food that they like, right? And I just don't really talk about it. People are kind of surprised by this, right? So this guy's vegan at home, but not vegan when he goes outside with other people, right? But still identifies as vegan, right? So it doesn't totally make sense necessarily, but for me, this proves like place really matters, right? The meanings of these different places shape the way this person thinks about themselves and the way their dietary practices move forward. Another example, this was an older gentleman in the UK who talked about having 3 daughters. The oldest turned vegetarian. Then over time, his other daughters were vegetarian. His wife was vegetarian. And so at home, it's vegetarian, right? And he still likes the taste, texture, flavor of a bacon sandwich, of a burger, but at home, in that place that has that meaning, right? Connected to that social network of his family, the stories that they've told about the importance of vegetarianism, the importance of animals in that place, he's vegetarian, mostly vegan, but outside of that place, he's something else. And so where do we get, how do we understand this? Well, there's been a ton of scholarship in the last couple decades on what's called choice architecture, the famous book by Thaler and Sunstein, Nudge, who talks about the parallels between traditional architecture and choice architecture. And the big idea here is that there's no such thing as a neutral design, that small and apparently insignificant details can have major impacts on people's behavior. And we should assume that everything matters when it comes to shaping the places in which we engage. And this has been put into practice in a variety of different areas. And we're going to talk about around dietary choice specifically. Here, there's a big emphasis on the automatic system of thinking, right? How can we change environments? How can we change choice architecture such that it makes the simple, easy thing to do to nudge them into the choice we want them to make, right? And it also, of course, connects to the socio-ecological model. How do we shift that physical environment, shift those community norms in ways that make what we're trying to do the easy thing to do? And so we've seen this put into practice in a big way in things like dining services. This is actually not a project that I was a part of, but I think it's instructive, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the work that I'm doing around this now. But this comes from the Better Food Foundation and the Food and Climate League, and they did this randomized controlled trial at 3 different university dining halls, Tulane, Lehigh, and RPI, Rensselaer Polytechnical Institute. And they had a couple different conditions, right? One was plant default days where only a plant-based dish was presented, but students could ask for meat if they, if they asked the staff. And then the control days where plant-based and meat dishes were served side by side. And so what did they find? Well, they found some real influence of choice architecture. On control days, about 27% of dishes served were plant-based. That went all the way up to almost 58% on those plant-based by default days. But they noted this was pretty much all explained by what happened at 2 of the schools, Tulane and Lehigh. It went from 30.8% of dishes served plant-based on the control days, all the way up to 81.5% of the dishes served on plant-based days were plant-based, right? So to me, that's interesting what succeeded. What's even more interesting to me is what failed, right? What went wrong at RPI? And they note that unlike Tulane and Lehigh, the proportion of plant-based dishes served at RPI remained unchanged between control and plant default days, right? So this says, hey, maybe it's not just about shifting environments. Maybe it's not just about changing choice architecture. What else is going on there? And if you read a little closer, they basically say that the staff wasn't bought in, right? The staff was not consistently putting this intervention into place. They were kind of in subtle ways, kind of nudging folks away from the plant-based dishes. They weren't bought in through that social network of the staff who were really key here. The story had not permeated, right? The story that this mattered, that this had value, had not become a part of the culture, right? So yeah, choice architecture matters here, but choice architecture absent culture buy-in, it's not going to have the impact. What we saw at the places where it worked well was cultural buy-in through those social networks of folks that mattered, right? In that place, that combined makes the change happen. And so I'll just say sort of briefly as I move towards a bit of a conclusion here. I'm working right now. I also have this role as a fellow at my university focused on sustainability. And right now I'm working through something called the STARS program, which is a sustainability tracking, assessment, and rating system created for colleges and universities to measure sustainability performance. And there's a bunch of different categories from the academics to operations, campus and public engagement, and coordination and planning. And within operations, there's a big area for food and beverage purchase, right? And institutions can get points points. And once you get points, you get these different ratings. And there's actually a big network effect here, and something I'm trying to convince my administration, right? Look at all the schools we're competing with and comparing ourselves to. Can we compete with that, that network and get this story more broadly throughout our university? And so right now I'm trying to figure out, how do I approach this within our dining services to prioritize more purchases of plant-based foods, to shift the choice architecture? And just a kind of key idea here is, yes, we need to change that choice architecture, but I also need to make sure that anybody involved in that process understands the story, is bought into that story, that's resilient across that social network. Only if the narratives and the networks align with the changes to the place, right, that those meanings make sense in those choice architectural environments, that's the way we can maximize success. Without one of those elements, one or more of those elements, we're going to see failure in these kinds of interventions. So I know that was a ton in a bit of Professor Broad mode here, right? Kind of putting out lots of big concepts, taking you through some of my research projects that demonstrate these dynamics in action. And so I just want to summarize with what are some of the key takeaways, and what can you use in your own work, whether you're doing advocacy or direct action, activism, or even scholarship in this area. What can we learn from some of these principles about changing the world for animals? So the first big one I want to reemphasize is that ecological models show us that interventions are most effective when they address these multiple levels of analysis, right? The individual, the social network, the community, and the societal. So anything that we can do to intervene across multiple levels and making sure that the higher levels are helping to enable the actions that we want to see put forth, whether it's in what people think or how people behave, that's going to be really effective. Ecological models also show us that the interventions are most effective when they're leveraging both the automatic and the deliberative thinking, right? Have to identify what needs this more reflective, identity-based persuasion, and what can be accomplished by these more shortcut heuristics. And how do we move these identities into the automatic thinking in a way that is more supportive of animal well-being? The next piece is that narrative theory shows us that people understand the world via stories they tell. And it also demonstrates that traditions are invented and they can be reinvented. So a big task for all of us is to figure out, how do we change the story? How do we reinvent our traditions in ways that provide greater respect for all animals? The next one is that social network theory shows that movements spread via complex contagion, and they gain traction when key messages are reinforced by multiple social contexts. We can't think about social change as just something that happens among a bunch of disconnected individuals. Network effects matter, and the more we can do to reinforce these stories that we want to be told across multiple nodes within that network in a way that reinforces, makes those messages more sticky, makes social change more possible. And the final piece is that theories of place show that we give meanings to the spaces we inhabit, both physical and digital. And so we need to think about, how do we shape and reshape our choice architecture to promote the kind of behaviors we want? But we need to make sure as well that we're combining that with culture change to transform local norms. Without that cultural element, the choice architecture will not be nearly as effective. So ecological models, narratives, networks, and place. These are some of the principles that have guided the research that I've done and some of the applied engaged work that I've done with movements for food system change and animal well-being. I hope you find them useful. I'm sure some of these are concepts, a lot of these are concepts that you're probably already working with, but hopefully this provides a little bit of a kind of, academic terminology that might help us understand what's going forth. But of course, I'd also love to hear from you. What resonates with you? What doesn't quite make sense here? But thank you so much for taking the time to be part of this conversation. And thank you for the work that you're doing to change the world for animals. So I'll leave it there and look forward to continuing the conversation. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Garrett. That was amazing. I'm really glad we recorded that, because I'm sure everyone will want to watch it again, because there's so much richness to that. So thank you so much. Got lots of messages coming through. I might be cheeky and ask a question first. Just thinking about your brilliant Vox article, and the link is in there for others to read in the chat. And I know, you were talking about how there's these animal categories, and you've mentioned before about how we kind of need to dismantle those categories and kind of blur those categories. I wondered if you could speak a bit more to that and approaches for that.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple things, right? One of the things that we often see is that personal experience plays a huge role, right? And so, I think we've all seen this also in media, right? The stories of pigs that people get to know, right? Of dogs that of making that connection between what's in their dinner plate and and what is what they consider to be a companion or a friend. And so that's something. How do we one, engage people in closer interactions with animals, particularly farmed animals and things like that, I think can have a really big role. I know like farm sanctuaries play this role here. The challenge with a thing like a farm sanctuary, of course, is that you can only get the folks who are coming through the farm sanctuary. And so I think there's a lot of work as well, trying to use more creative media storytelling to get those stories out more publicly. And I think we have seen some impact of things like, some of these charismatic stories of pigs that have become adopted and become part of the family and things like that. And so, yeah, that direct personal experience really makes a key difference. The other big thing is the social network effect, right? We know this just from any health behavior study, right? Probably the most studied health behavior in my field is smoking, right? And the biggest predictor of whether one smokes and whether one is able to quit smoking is whether they have contacts, so close social contacts that support them in that process, or that smoke, right? And so, and this can be our direct, interpersonal connections. So people who smoke are much more likely to be in families with other people who smoke, for instance. But we also have seen a lot of really effective work done to bring people into digital support communities and things like that to provide support so that they're going through this process. And so anything that we can do to make sure that folks know that they're not alone in this process. I also, at one earlier version of this already too long presentation, had some stuff around like Veganuary, right? And I think that's another example of these kind of digital accountability processes, being part of communities, right? Folks, we are, as humans, are enmeshed in social networks, as I said, right? We look to our social norms around us. It's really difficult to go against that grain. And so when we feel like we're not alone in this process, I mean, I don't know about you, but I've been the only vegan at the barbecue before, right? And that's hard to do. It takes a particular type of personality, particular stubborn type person like me, right, to be able to go up against those norms. And so what can we do to build those community networks, to help people build those connections? And so I think there's a lot of good work happening in the broader animal movement to build those connections, build that accountability, have that social support. So those would be probably the two biggest things. One, those direct experiences that just kind of change things, and those can be direct experiences with animals or mediated experiences. And then also this ongoing social support, huge predictor of what makes change sustainable.
Amazing. Thanks, Garrett. We have a few questions coming in. So got one from Alex. He said, at Viva, we had 45 out of 50 inquiries each day coming in from teenage girls when we launched. We targeted them through their magazines via interviews with vegetarian celebrities, such as teen idol pop stars. Are there particular communities that are more receptive or less receptive to our messages? Obviously, teenage girls, but who else would you say?
Yeah, so the question is, are there particular communities that are more or less receptive to animal messages in general? Is that the question? Sort of animal well-being? Yeah. So I mean, look, we do see certain socio-demographic characteristics as well as broader kind of attitudinal characteristics. We know historically that kind of progressive women are and progressive young women are the kind of backbone of a lot of animal protection movements, veganism, right? That is a fact that has been around for a long time. So it's not surprising to me, Alex, that was the group, right? And there's sociodemographically, culturally, there's something there about progressive young women that is a big piece of this. And so I think, any communication strategy requires an understanding of your audience and developing messages that resonate with that audience. And so it's a challenge though, right? Because you want to do it while maintaining a value set that is consistent with your broader approach. So I know, I think about like the Game Changers movie, for instance, if folks have seen, which the basic idea, the basic thesis behind this was, yeah, all the vegetarians are women. That's an oversimplification, right? But if you've heard the people who made that movie, that's kind of how they say it, right? And so we wanted to make this kind of manly movie that shows you can be a strong dude and you can be a vegetarian, right? And I think, yeah, there is some value in that kind of micro targeting, but I also know it gets a lot of blowback from folks who say, hey, this is reinforcing some of these patriarchal norms that many of us come to this movement to resist to begin with, right? And I think that's a really valid and legitimate critique. I would just say, you kind of have to, as an organization, figure out like what are you trying to do here, right? Are you trying to activate the group that is most likely to pay attention? Right. And if so, you can kind of lean on that initial group that you've already hearing from and figure out how do you target them, who are the messengers and the messaging platforms that make most sense there. Or are you trying to widen the net, right? Are you trying to have a broader appeal? Or are you trying to have an appeal to a group that's a little harder to reach? I mean, big picture, what matters a lot is always, does the message resonate with them? But also, are the sources that they're hearing it from trusted on that issue in particular? And then I think the reason we see clusters of teenage girls, for instance, is because it's being reinforced in their social network, right? And so we can't expect that just one, influencer is going to do the trick, right? It has to be sustained contact over time through different elements of their broader social network. And so making sure that you have, kind of influencers at different places of the networks that you're trying to reach them, that's going to be a way to reach beyond that kind of, easiest to reach to get to some of the harder reach groups. I hope that answers your question, but happy to chat further later if you'd like.
Yeah, just a reminder for everyone, we've got a after hours session straight after this, and I put the link in the chat. So we'll have another half hour with Garrett and recorded, and people can ask questions. Natalia, you should be able to unmute yourself, I think, to ask your question, hopefully.
Yeah, thank you. Effective altruism bases itself on utilitarianism. I personally don't go for it for various reasons that we may or may not go into. But basically, if you happen to consider utilitarianism not a valid philosophical position, if your thing is either virtue ethics or deontology, where do you go from that? Is there a kind of an equivalent based on a different philosophical system?
Within the movement broadly, I think certainly, right? And my goal here was not to say that the EA way is the way for the movement, right? And I saw some, notes in the chat that we could, would love a whole other EA conversation. And I don't know if other folks might be at AVA. I'll be at AVA, the Animal and Vegan Advocacy Summit coming up. I know some folks might be making the trip there. I know there's some EA sessions and things like that. I think it's a really interesting movement that has some. I think there's been some value that's been brought by that movement, but I've also, for many years, had some critiques of it that I think have come to the fore in the last couple of years. We've seen a sort of EA in crisis moment. But I would say, in general, in the movement, Natalia, utilitarianism is certainly not the only way to think about things. And that many folks are driven by a more, as you say, kind of virtue ethics-driven approach, a more kind of Kantian ethics approach as opposed to the utilitarian ethics. I think my point was more to say that, the utilitarian strand, and Peter Singer probably being the philosophical, leader of that branch of the animal movement, and his work obviously super influential in the EA movement. That's always been a part of the broader animal protection movement. But I think with EA and the way that it has constructed these networks over time, and of course, because of the funding it's got behind it, I think it's made this utilitarian way of thinking even stronger in the movement, and even bigger part of the movement over the last decade than it was before that. So yeah, I mean, how do you combat that if you're trying to put forth a different type of approach? I mean, my general philosophy on that is that, there's plenty of room for action. And that, my general philosophy is that I support folks trying to make a difference. And so would love to see lots of organizations offering alternative messaging approaches, alternative ways of defining what value looks like and how we evaluate that value. But certainly I don't think utilitarianism is the only way, and I certainly don't think the EA approach is the only way. But my main point was just to say, the way that they've cultivated networks has been a really influential piece of our broader movement. And it's worth figuring out and reflecting on how they got to that point. I hope that's somewhat useful, Natalia. Happy to chat further.
Thanks, Garrett. Got another question from Isadora asking, are there any study groups for people to join with specific focus on these subjects? Isadora, I don't know if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question directly, otherwise I can ask it for you. But yeah, just Isadora works for an NGO, and she said it'd be useful to gather and brainstorm. So Garrett, yeah, any study groups there?
Yeah, so there are a couple that come to mind. I go to something called a Recap, which I believe is technically I'm trying to find, as I'm talking, I'm Googling, which is something you're never supposed to do in these kinds of things. So there's this group, Recap, Research to End Animal Food Production. If there's anybody in the chat who maybe has a link that would help, that is, I think, an interesting group. Oh, I did find it. Okay, so I'll put this in the chat. So this is a group that meets monthly to talk about, a group of social science researchers from academia, research institutes, and NGOs who share the goal of ending animal product consumption. So it definitely has more of a focus on the food side of the movement. But it's been a place where I've definitely seen some really interesting presentations, a lot of works in progress, and a cool combination of folks who come from this from a more academic perspective, but also research that's coming out of out of NGOs themselves. So that might be one place to start. And I would also just say that, always looking to chat more with folks who are interested in the research side. I think one of the things we have seen in recent years is a bigger focus on research within the nonprofit, community, and really thinking. I think Animal Think Tank's a great example of this, right? Really thinking about like what are the foundational theories that are bringing to this work, and then how do we evaluate the effectiveness of this work, and how do we even define something like effectiveness? I think is an important question to ask as well. But I would say, a lot of NGOs themselves, I think, are doing, producing a lot of really good work here. So if you don't have a group within your group that's thinking about research, maybe a good place to start. But I also think something like this convening these webinars are another great space for these conversations. These conferences that I've mentioned, one that I'll be at soon, bring together a lot of researchers. So I think the opportunity to kind of have conversations about research and the movement is, I've been doing work around this stuff for almost 20 years at this point, 15, 20 years at this point. And I think we're in a much better place in terms of thinking about the research side than we were going back to when I first got interested in these things. But happy to talk more, Isadora, about ways we might keep you connected to the research side.
Brilliant. Thanks, Garrett. That's all we have time for in this main session. So thanks to everyone for joining. I've put the link in the chat for the after hours session where we can chat more intimately and recorded. And just to say, our next webinar is Wednesday, the 29th of May. And it's going to be me actually talking about narrative strategy and what we can learn from other social movements and also from business and politics as well. So hope you can join for that. And yeah, like I say, link is in the chat. So hope everyone can join us in the next session. And thanks again,
Great.
Garrett. This has been amazing.
Thank you so much to Animal Think Tank for this, and really for all of you for spending the time to be part of this conversation, and for all the good work that you do. I really do appreciate it and look forward to continuing the conversation in the after hours session. Thanks again, everybody.
See you soon, everyone.